Hello everyone, today we talk about medieval French musical instruments. Making French history during the Middle Ages is incredibly complex, also because it's not properly just French history, but also Occitanian one and more. But it's also a challenge in as much as I think you can never say enough about France as a whole. It's rare to find sort of comprehensive synthesis about such an enormous the most important, the largest actually, civilizational output right in medieval Europe. And therefore, to illustrate this from, say, a specific track without digressing to the various brooklets that are actually major, say, like an Amazon river each, considering the cultural legacy of medieval France. And so, lacking in the latter case, however, the even bigger picture that should be maintained, right? So you would think, well, but Schwerpunkt, you're a polymologist. Why the hell do you talk about history of music? You're not even an expert about that. Yeah, it's true, but if I didn't do this, I would probably miss something of the entire picture. And so I think, first of all, it's not the first time we talk about medieval music. We talk about military music in general, not much from a strictly musical point of view, but observing essentially the meaning, right? The traditional significance of sound in a religious, spiritual, transcendental fashion, and we will keep coming on that because having studied, as you know, my share of medieval battles, I came to the realization that probably there is an incredible lack of awareness of how powerful music really was, even in Western Europe. You see, the idea is that most, and this is actually correct historically for different reasons we don't have time to explain today, that most, also military music, spread from essentially the Middle East, the Levant, right? And there were specific and practical reasons looking at those armies' function that required that sort of musical direction, right? And so the thing is, but in the West we didn't have as much as that, and so basically it's too few in comparison. Let's just look at what they had there. But if you let's say here, of course, it depends largely, of course, on the level of documentation, and as you can imagine, we, albeit of course there is a point in time from which evidence starts being very important. You can quantify that. There is also a huge, like for the majority of the Middle Ages, chunk of unknown, right, that you can't quite simply reconstruct on the basis of other sources or comparatively, because it has really to do with how strong it was within Western Europe itself. And if you lack the sources as you lack them normally for those times, also for other places in general, you should just accept that there could be much more to it that you do not see. This is a very common mistake that is done, right? I made videos on how properly the historical narrative of the early, high, and late Middle Ages actually revolves around, right? You think that we have a sort of uniform, homogeneous understanding of medieval history. This is not the case for any history whatsoever. Every historian has, in so many ways, very different views on history, and even, say, more or less the same fields, same subjects of research. But there are literal narratives that stem from the course type of evidence that you mostly have, the kind of evidence that you have. So that for early medieval Europe especially, we tend to say, well, we don't have sources, so likely was a miserable moment, and in part, of course, that contraction that had happened, it is true, but meaning that since we can see what was there, probably there wasn't much. And this is completely insane as a line of reasoning, because as soon as you scratch just a little bit underneath the surface, you realize that there is a universe that opens itself, and music has a lot to do with properly the entire spirit of the era. That is, in fact, also the most difficult one to measure, right? Because how do you measure moral forces? You must get in tune, in fact, with traditional meanings to understand that. And music had an incredibly different role compared to today's, or even just in, say, in the times in which it was actually good music in good quantity, right? From a historical point of view. And the simple reason being that the older, say, the more back you go in time, and the more you're gonna understand how sound, right, music playing encompass basically any aspect of human life, and to a collective level, importantly, a public one that connected the community with the divinity. And that fundamentally was meant to replicate a specific feeling, right? That was to evoke the necessary, in fact, emotions, right? The necessary moral forces, let's say better, in order to live in a certain way, right? Considering that this was also largely literate world, oral tradition went together with all these kind of motives. If you think about that, even poetry was basically the same level. It was often sung just by genre historically. And when you look at, I don't know, some songs, some pop songs that you do know, in spite of not knowing practically any poetry anymore, having the two things by some degree separated, you realize that really our say that poetry at some point, just like it could be today for common people, and in many ways in the past was, right, music, and the reason why it sticks in our mind is that it makes us feel in a certain way. After all, why would we listen to music at all, right? It's a way for us to connect with certain sublimated values that we couldn't quite grasp otherwise. And considering the variety of the same music, this tells you also how adaptable to all sort of universal circumstances this can be, and so how ad hoc, right, how manifest, right, this music had to be in order to describe and to make the same situation, the same accompanying the very actions that change the world step by step, right? In traditional view, there is no such thing like, well, one thing happened and it didn't matter, right? Even if it's, I don't know, a very simple thing. Everything that happens matters because it's going to be fixed in the universe forever. That is to say, nothing after that will be ever the same because of it, right? And music was believed in many ways to be a higher form of expression that connected humanity with the divinity, and so to inspire positive deeds in that way. And this is true also for any kind, for prayer, for spectacles in general. Everything came like together, and as we have seen in the videos about military music, well, a battle was pretty much the same. You needed those moral forces to be evoked, to be summoned through music. There was something, of course, celestial, divine. If you look at the same principles of Gothic art that was cultivated essentially here between England and France, originally to really replicate the universal hierarchy, and so on Earth, right? Well, you would think this architecture was based on Vitruvius' treatise or something like that. This was actually based on Augustine's De Musica, right? And other works that fundamentally were looking at a divine perfection through the perfection of the same harmony that music was cultivated in order to achieve, again, simulate. And this is the point. We have this tendency to associate musical instruments primarily with concert or dance music in our time, right? In the past, this was very different, right? The music held this much broader and relevant significance, right? Deep significance. Instruments served, first of all, by the way, not just to evoke right, this force. But as we've seen throughout political culture, military culture, as a profound, not just symbol, but manifestation of authority. And we will see it better today, meaning that the nobility was regularly accompanied by this musical aura. There were people literally announcing them, say, following them with these tones, etc. They had to essentially replicate the same divinity that this person, as a medium, as endowed with the Holy Ghost, with the Imperium, would simply emanate, and that in fact in the same music would manifest itself. Right? We've seen in the video about Islamic military music how in certain cultures, for example the Khwarezmian one in the Middle Ages, it was probably the highest expression of the divinization of the same instrument. Right? Think about the Nakarakana, but specifically the Khwarezmian rite, for which instead of the hero on the golden chariot that had to lead to heaven, there was a major drum, and all the princes, hosts / hostages at the Khwarezmian court had to play smaller instruments to celebrate the music, the glory of the leader. And there was actually a very unique blend of ancient Indo-European transcendence and Islamic one at that point in history, and we will partly come back on this. But indeed, the larger, I also made recently, a couple months ago, if I'm not wrong, a video on the Ottoman musical bands, and as we were saying before, it was mostly the Ottomans that from an early age had this very developed sort of musical bands that eventually were copied even by the modern ones all over the world in terms of instruments, of symbols, etc. And they had collected that same meaning. Now in Europe it was actually pretty much the same, just it had a different flavor, different bias, but the meaning again was actually the same. I will not descend now. I'd say Europeans were per capita wealthier, more sedentary, and sort of also more, in the sense, bulkier. I think specifically from a military point of view, heavier, to differentiate too much their music in order to, say, spur that massive, thickly packed cavalry charge, right, of heavy horsemen. So that's actually the point, right? You would need, for a Mongol army or a Seljuk army with all those swarms of and human type of horse archers, this continuous sort of coordination, and everything had to go in tune and be perfectly millimetric, because everything went back and forth very rapidly. European armies were sort of more compact, heavier, slower, not less effective as a matter of fact, and so correspondingly music was sort of more, in part more solemn even, but also simpler in a way. The nobility was obviously associated with music, and again, not just from a military point of view, right? In any case, that's what their power substantiated itself like. Music was indispensable in military practice, but it also accompanied storytellers and legions, right? The nobility was cultivated through the summoning again of those emotions. These were people who were capable of chopping people to pieces without blinking an eye, and still maybe they were sung of those angelic women that represented, of course, the transfigured glory, right, from the darkest forces of the soul. And these people were thinking, right, of their mothers, of their sisters when they had abandoned them, right, when they were like 6-7 years old to become squires in somebody else's household, and being traumatically destroyed as human beings to be rebuilt as purely slaughtering machines. And there, these emotions were the same ones that they needed to resummon to maintain their own Apollonian control on the scene. It was incredibly hard, but that's what those men really were. So, again, legends and tradition and the ancient myths, etc., the epos, chivalric romance. As you know, we're pretty much made lots of videos started really also about the French ones, like the chansons de geste, especially the culture of the Languedoc. We have to look a bit more also at the Languedoc had meant in the even in as you see as chivalric epos, as with the rise of France as a sort of translatio imperii. That is to say, we have these legions because we are the stock from which these deeds of all these heroes stemmed from. So it's an incredibly unsecular and modern thinking, and usually chivalric epos is not presented like this, but that's what it factually had been, and also with a striking continuity with ancient times. Let's say musical instrument maintained, of course, also their sort of recreational role in supporting song and dance, but the latter also were all connected with these other meanings, right? There couldn't be a separation from that. It was like an entire universal spectrum. This is true especially for Western Europe, because in the Byzantine world, as you know, the only properly defined Byzantine music was ecclesiastical music, right? So everything else was not Byzantine in the sense that it was, in practice, also very Western nature, right? And or coming in from the eastern part. But say that's peculiar to Byzantine history. Today we talk France. And we also have to define the boundaries for this too, because how did French music and musical instruments differ from the rest of Western Europe? Not that much, as a matter of fact, but still there is some characterization. Now, the various literary references, our daily bread as medievalists, highlight the vibrant auditory landscape that enriched medieval French villages, courts, and countryside. There is an interesting quote from a flamenca of the mid-13th century that I translate. It is, the jugglers began their tale, one took his instrument and played, and the other sang with his mouth. Whoever knew fiddle tunes, or cançons, or discord, or lay, these are all different kind of music, as the best he could gave it a try. One played harp, another fiddle, one a flute, the other a whistle. One played a giga, another the rote. One said the words, and another the notes. One played a pipe, another a panpipe. One the bagpipe, the other a shone. On the mandora, and the other struck the psaltery with one string. 200 jugglers, good fiddlers, got in tune with each other. 2 by 2 they sat scattered about on the benches and fiddled the dance, not missing a note. And there is an interesting Occitanian author, very famous one actually, in medieval Europe, Bertrand de Born, 1140-1215. This is also famous for Dante because he was a knight, right? And he had created a bit of a mess among his patrons, and for this reason he was represented as beheaded in hell by the Italian author to say that they actually liked him a big deal, because of course French Occitanian music was pretty famous all over Western Europe, and this, like Bertrand de Born, is really a great name. But so showing also the variegated, the complex background of these individuals. Remember that the same concept of the warrior bard, the fact that we do know perfectly well that the peak of male violence is also the peak of male creativity, and so that think about the Minnesänger, think about they were knights, they were people again capable of slaughtering large numbers of people on a regular basis, but that also were provided with I don't even how to define, a moving, an incredible, divine-like human sensitivity that and poetical vein that is unspeakable. We can't quite find any, because this really is expressed by the top professional, the top elite of the time. So many resources were concentrated, and so many people working just for these guys. These were so polyedric and incredible, and emanating all this culture and civilization. And Bertrand de Born at some point says, "When I see unfurled among the orchards banners of yellow, violet, and blue, the neighing of the horses soothes me, and the songs the minstrels sing as they go fiddling from tent to tent, and the trumpets and horns and clarions clear. Then I want to compose a Cervantes." It was a poetical genre for Count Richard to hear. This is the typical picture of courtesy at the time, but you see here that list of musical instrument goes together with the list of the colors of the banners. This is fascinating because every music was this is just like I'm sure there is a branch of whatever in history that studies like from even paintings, etc., what kind of music this can express on the basis of colors. All right. And indeed, just like with heraldry, all these symbols, all these sounds, all these dicta, all these, as a wall, right? The knight as a wall and his expression and whatever was thought to literally and metaphysically bind all together to express at the end of the day, the quality of these individuals. And everybody was different in this regard. And so their music really was, right? This is a courtly scene. It can be just like a tournament, just as a battle. Also because in Bertrand times, there wasn't really a difference between tournaments and war. So there is also an archaeological perspective, that is the bitter realization that very few musical instruments remain materially from this time period, being obviously most organic, but not just for that. So, because we do have some. Now, our understanding of them comes from written and visual sources, and we can only speculate about the sounds they produced. Additionally, their shapes and likely their sounds evolved throughout the centuries to fit the changing society's needs. And we barely know much about that, which such scanning material evidence. As you understand, even just without being musical experts, it's obvious that if we don't even know how many people played at a time or what for, etc., yes, we have some actual written music, as like from throughout all the era, but we do not know fully like how this music was played. Probably we would be amazed by the actual complexity of the same. Not by written kind, but still in the sort of composition that they could put together in an improvised fashion. And so the capacity also to change together with the mood, the circumstance, that's the thing that would strike us the most, together with likely also the capacity of imitating natural sounds. As far as the representation of the word's harmony was concerned, this was in part recuperated from, say, I don't know, if you could think Bach, right, and his incredibly complex, and also sort of, there are some chords in Bach that literally I think he only used ever, or at least, in a meaningful sense, in musical history, that really reflected the idea that, you had to scope every single aspect of the creation of the universe. But even Mozart is like this. Like some people think that he was a sort of romantic or pre-romantic, not just a classicist. But the truth is that he was like in his amazing capacity of sort of covering the entire spectrum of emotions. He was really that fully classicistic because he was really encompassing the entire nature and of emotions, and more so. This was, in many ways, the traditional magic that music still had that late in time, 17th, 18th century. You can imagine during the Middle Ages, right? Independently from the complexity of the single, say, musical instruments performance or whatever, it's, again, what these people did collectively that we have irremediably lost forever, and that that couldn't even be written down because likely that complexity could not quite simply was improvised. In fact, we could not be quite put down, written just per se. This is a problem we have with lots of things. It's just like saying how we can reproduce a medieval weapon, more or less, but we have on the surface. But like how to give ergonomy to a medieval sword, well, that's a craft that is completely lost. Doesn't matter how advanced our engineering is, we have no capacity whatsoever to replicate it. And also because, of course, we have not the paid study of how they actually went with that. Consequently, also our knowledge of medieval music instruments can only be discussed in general terms. These instruments came, without saying, in a wide range of varieties, and from medieval iconography we also learned that while they can be grouped and labeled, there was actually no standardization in terms of size, shape, or design. Well, of course, there was some, as we will see now, some categorization, some tendency, but the idea is that, again, to each one their own, and so even in terms of artistic expression, this could vary dramatically. Now, although there are no instruments that can be exclusively classified as French, for the sake of this video, as most seem to have been used by all European countries, certain instruments appear more frequently in French sources. Indeed, as the following notes now that we take just from essentially a French background will illustrate. I say French, meaning, say, the contemporary boundaries of at least today's continental France. Now, medieval Europe inherited from the Greek-Roman period a relatively simple musical instrument set, right? And didn't change particularly up to well into, say, the heart of the Middle Ages, as we will see now, right? Again, the ancient world can be incredibly complex, but just like in the medieval one, especially musical tradition, we see that, again, Europeans were fundamentally very concrete, very practical. So this enormous musical development was not particularly necessary, even just to express specific ideas. There is a sense that, just like in tradition, in primitiveness, that the more veracious values were the simplest ones, right? And so that also in music, even, say, very austere sort of simple instruments were enough to some degree, and so more solemn. Now, these instruments included trumpets for war and heraldry, as you understand. There is no need to explain the obvious, right? I have an entire paragraph of my master thesis back in the day, too many years gone by, that actually describes the for given medieval battle the various instruments and how they were used, right? For example, there was a huge drum that was used to put the entire army together. You see, every unit, of course, had the smallest, let's say, its own musical instruments based on the size of the organic, right, importance of it. And so there were also some more general instruments for the entire army. And again, from my survey, I think historically, as brief as it was, I think that there is an incredible overlook of the actual development and spread of musical instruments, especially from a military point of view in Western Europe, way before the Ottomans, the modern age, etc. Heraldry we also explained, right? Every guy was sort of introduced in a different way, also musically. Then you had plucked harps and lyres accompanying songs, right? You could see small pastoral flutes as well. People would just have these instruments for fun. During the Carolingian era, new instruments were developed in various secular centers throughout Europe. And the reason for the introduction of these instruments was essentially the development of feudal society and the emergence of courtly traditions. right? In a politically more hierarchical system, of course, the elite had to represent itself in an ever more magnificent way. This went in parallel with, for example, the celebration in the troubadour and trouvère lyrics, which are typical of the region, as you know. Now, crusades also played a role in the introduction of many new instruments from the Arabic and Byzantine musical cultures. Also about this, we should think that, say, there wasn't a radical divide actually in the typology of instruments between Europe, the Mediterranean, the Levant, etc. But as we've seen, there was a different use that were made of the same. And in fact, some instruments wouldn't even find their way in Europe from the outside and vice versa, because if the reasons for which they were played, the context were played, were irreplicable in that different context. Now, the wide variety of medieval instruments can be observed in Machaut, Remède de Fortune, which dates approximately to the 40s of the 14th century. This is a very famous source. It does not encompass all the instruments that were popular at the time, but it gives a pretty opulent idea of the saying. It goes something like this: and after the meal you should have seen the musicians arrive, all combed and comfortably attired. They played various harmonies, for there are all in a circle, I saw. And here he lists all the instruments said in French: the viol, rebelle, guiterne, leu, morache, michanon, citole, and the psalterion, harpe, tambour, trompe, naquère, orgue, corne, plus des paires, cornemuse, flageoles, chevrette, dulcine, cymbale, clochette, timbre, la flûte, brehenne, et les grands cornets d'Allemagne. This is interesting too, because of course there were instruments from different. See, the French had the term le grand épée d'Allemagne. Here you have le grand cornet d'Allemagne. So apparently, Germans has sort of some gigantic tastes for some reason. Flageolet de son, fistule, pipe, mousse de C, trompette, buccine, aile, monocorde, où il n'a qu'une seule corde, et muse de bluff du ensemble, etc. Because it says, and it certainly seems to me that such a melodious sound had never been perceived or heard, and whatever could be played with finger, pick or bow I heard in perfect harmony there in the little park. Right? And this is of course an exaggeration, because as it's possible, of course, there were these sort of meetings in which, of course, all these instruments could be played at once. Still, this could simply be a literary expedient to list all the type of instruments you could have found in this circumstance. Now, Machaut vividly describes in these passages the combination, and all these verses actually, of the instruments playing together, but it is highly unlikely. In fact, it is true that all the instruments mentioned were used during that time, there's no doubt about it, but they would have hardly played simultaneously, because they were just too different. And even it doesn't matter how sort of complex, right, that improvising music could be, it would have not made too much sense just to which bands could be so large just to practice with all this different. It's just would have not made much sense. And by the way, the order in which they are listed in the poem we have read is more related to the poetic requirements of line length and creating a vibrant image rather than suggesting that an actual musical ensemble. The poet has indiscriminately blended various types of sounds, but in reality, the ensemble in which these instruments were played were strictly organized based on their respective types. And we will see how the latter differed dramatically from our categories. In fact, the grouping of musical instruments during the Middle Ages differed very much from today. Instead of being classified based on sound mechanism and material type, the way we do, like for example bowed strings or brass, they were instead categorized into distinct groups based on volume, whole and bas, that is high and low, right? Instruments with loud or shrill sounds called whole were considered separate from those with soft sounds called bas, and they were played accordingly. Bas is the same word from which bass comes from, right? So that's the thing. While there were numerous combinations within each group, of course, instruments from one group were never played alongside the instrument of the other. Generally, the loud instruments were used outdoors for military purposes or during festive occasions where loud sounds enhanced the excitement, such as weddings, tournaments, or grand feasts. Right? Trumpets, drums, bagpipes, and a reed instrument called a shawm belonged to this group. On the other hand, the soft instruments were typically used to accompany songs and even included the human voice, of course. So again, any instrument really and any other auxilium support, etc., were considered as part of the performance. There is nothing so strange conceptually about this, but again, we could have been amazed by the complexity of these arrangements. Machaut lists 3 percussion instruments in the loud ensemble: the tabbour, that was a sizable field drum; the naker, that is a remember the nakara we've mentioned before, that's where it came from as a term, by the way, because there was considerable linguistic influence, in fact, from the East as well, from quite a while. A duo of, in this case, the naker, duo petit kettle drums, right, typically attached to the drummer's waist, and cymbal, that is cymbals. These instruments were commonly accompanied by an array of trumpets varying in size, with some termed as large and small, while others possessed distinct designations like the buccine. The buccine is a lengthy and curved trumpet known for its vibrant, raucous, and piercing sound. It's the Roman buccina. I made a video about Roman musical instruments. Of course, there was a lot connected with that as well. Trumpets had various uses, in fact, in the military, in the Middle Ages, just like in the ancient era, and some of these had de facto not changed, right? Signaling and rallying troops during battles, as we've seen, having to be, precise, clear. Say, if you wonder why, some helmets were properly given open in the ears, etc., because they had to receive complex orders different times. You can measure even there the tactical complexity on how much music was, of course, played, how much sound signals were necessary. And additionally, trumpets enhanced the ambience and excitement of festivals and tournaments and added grandeur to civil and religious processions. During elaborate feasts, trumpets often signaled the change in curses, and there are occasional recordings of them being played during the elevation of Mass as well. However, their main role was to symbolize the nobility, tradition that had never ended throughout Europe. It was customary for pairs of trumpets accompanied by banners to precede noblemen as they carried out their official duties in the streets, but not only. Think about the Roman triumph back in the day. So the presence of the trumpets clearly denoted the significance of the noble they accompanied. It was a sort of, again, divine Apollonian meaning, especially in the striking sort of, the trumpet hits the tympanum, right? That's why, for example, cavalry charges were led by that, right? And infantry instead was sort of hypnotized into combat through the rolling of the drum, right, from the within. So it was a completely different reality, especially time in which, of course, the feudal elite was so different in divide from the foot commoners, politically, militarily, and socially. Two woodwind instruments, the shone and the cornemuse, were added to the loud ensemble of percussion and brass instruments. The shone, also known as chalumeau in French, was a predecessor of the modern oboe and was popular in Europe from the 12th century. It was actually a great moment in the development of music, together with, as we've seen, even the Gothic concept, the revival, the same musical studies of these harmonies, proportions, numerology, and more. The shone came in different sizes, with alto and tenor ranges being the most popular. In the late 14th century, a bass instrument called the bombard, resembling the homonymous cannon, was introduced, which is sort of fascinating because it's naturally a coincidence in part that we're talking about that kind of weapon from essentially the late 13th to beginning of 14th century. We find in the at least at the end of the 14th century, in fact, a new instrument that was called and shaped like the artillery piece. The cornemuse, that is a bagpipe, also came in various sizes, configurations with different numbers of chanters and drone pipes. Military scenes, tournaments, jousts later on. In dancing, often depicted shones and bagpipes alongside trumpets and drums, which is again eloquent about the distribution of these instruments respectively. The shone and bagpipe had a wider range of notes compared to the trumpet, allowing them to play melodies as well as fanfare and heraldic sounds. So of course we are in the later Middle Ages, and this brought to again a further consolidation of the elites, right? And as such, ever greater display was even institutionalized from a musical point of view. Dancing scenes commonly featured 2 or 3 shones, sometimes accompanied by a bagpipe. Towards the end of the 15th century, a dance ensemble typically consisted of 2 or 3 shones and a slide trumpet, which would later be replaced by a trombone. The vielle, or fiddle, is also frequently mentioned as the most common soft instrument used in various types of music. In medieval times, the fiddle had either 4 or 5 strings and could be found in different sizes, ranging from soprano to bass, as depicted in artwork and sculptures. Some of these depictions show a flat bridge, indicating that it could only produce sound by playing multiple strings simultaneously. However, there are also representations of a rounded bridge, suggesting that certain fiddles were capable of playing single-line melodies as well. It was in the late 11th century that the fiddle, along with another bowed instrument called the 3-string rebec, or roubel, was introduced in France, in Europe, from the Levant. And prior to this, all string instruments in Europe were played by plucking, resulting in a wide range of sizes, shapes, and numbers of strings accordingly, which adds to the sort of customization we were talking about before. It was not really much of a standard at some point. The harp, guitar, and lute were instead the main plucked string instruments. The harp could have 10 to 25 strings. The guitar could have 3 to 5 strings, either in pairs or singles, and the lute typically had 5 pairs of strings. The cithole, which resembled the guitar, had metal strings, while the lute, guitar, and harp were strung with guts for a softer sound. The guitar, cithole, and lute were also plucked with a plectrum, and the harp was occasionally played with one as well, right? This basically, for anybody who plays the guitar, right, it's obvious that it increased, say, the definition of the single chord sound, but at the same time it sort of limited really the amount once you could play. At least you could be that good. It's still feasible, but right, this depends also on the type of music that was played, and so this is actually a bit too much for today's topic because we just look at the instruments. Another instrument in the aforementioned category was the psaltery, which had 10 to 20 metal strings stretched across a wooden sound box. Interestingly enough, this psaltery came in various shapes as well, and could be plucked with a plectrum or hammered even. And all of these instruments were considered suitable for jongleurs and were often used to accompany song and dance. Right, so these guys would just travel with their own instruments and be able to put up these shows. The hurdy-gurdy. This is an interesting string instrument played by a rotating wheel, also part of the bass group associated with the minstrels, by the way, although it is mentioned less frequently. There was the organistrum in Latin, a two-player variation of the hurdy-gurdy, often seen in the hands of church elders on Gothic cathedral tympana. However, it is unclear what role, if any, it played in church music. Right? It could have been just, a broader symbol or something that did not correspond really to reality or had never been historic. The organ, belonging to the soft group, is another member in this category. This term not only refers to the larger church instrument, but also the small portable organ held on the lap, which minstrels used as a melody instrument. The gentle breezes consisted of flutes, flageolets, recorders, and the resonant reed instruments, cromorne and dulciane. The bagpipe was occasionally included in the category of lower pitched instruments, suggesting a specific kind of bagpipe was adjusted in volume to blend in with the other members of the soft group. It's likely that this particular type of bagpipe was mentioned by the troubadour Père d'Alverne in the 12th century, when he says this verse was performed with a bagpipe at Puivet, with everyone participating and enjoying themselves. The haut and bas instruments were not only separated during performances, but they were also typically assigned to different categories of musicians. Musicians who played trumpets, drums, and chaûns formed essentially a unique group of servant musicians dedicated to these instruments and exclusively performed in these ensembles. These musicians were commonly employed by the local government and given specific responsibilities. Right? There was definitely a sort of official, personnel that would be increasingly more regular, permanent, let's say, even towards the end of the Middle Ages, to regularly perform such music for the various institutional occasions that required them. The soft instruments were played, however, by individuals, but from every part of the social spectrum, including noblemen, peasants, masters, and servants. Right? Although it is, of course, difficult to determine if specific instruments were preferred by any of the various estates, evidence from both visual and written sources suggests that during the 14th century most soft instruments were played by people really from all estates. This could have been in part due also to the to the greater spread, like at the beginning of the greater enlargement at the beginning of the early 14th century, of sort of greater freedom among the estates. Right, and during the course of the century, it's likely that social differences became once again so steep that there were some sort of differences as well. But the world had secularized a bit more, and generally speaking, literacy had been increasing. There was sort of a greater sense of, say, enjoyment to some degree, in spite of all the difficulties that society was going through at that point. It's possible that music played, or the music played on these instruments differed to some extent as well, that we can't quite recognize. It's obvious that the elite would be, say, playing different music from the one of the peasantry. But, that there is much of musical background culture that has to do with an important say share also an awareness. Of course, the elite did lead to some extent also among the commoners. So everything was, and especially when, say, representing each other at this point, when estates were becoming ever more institutionalized, of course, of a mutual exchange, like you have at this point the patrician nobility of the great city-states being imitated by the feudal elite, and vice versa, because they were trying essentially to achieve each other's sort of top. Of course, this was still very high elite compared to anybody else, right? But there was still a different background, right? And that did matter particularly. The same goes as far as language, right? The way these songs were, the lyrics, right, were made, of course, did provide with that enormous divide. But it's obvious that, say, the lower classes had they were the majority of the system, so they didn't write to great extent. So much of most what was produced at the time, in fact, among the commoners, went lost for lack of recording. We truly do not have any information about the repertoire of the lower classes. Aristocrats, as we've seen, also played these instruments. Their servants were entertainers, such as minstrels and jongleurs. They were also expected to be skilled in multiple soft instruments on their own. Starting in the early 15th century, there was a significant transformation, however, in musical instruments and how they were played. As polyphonic music, in fact, became more popular with the noble classes, the courtly music scene called for the instruments that could play individual lines without the use of drones, and had a wide range that included chromatics as well. This change is crucial, and it does have to do with France as well, because France had really a very important musical tradition at this point, right? The various also religious orders, the sort of hierarchization of the establishment, etc., brought to, say, the noble women to be collectively educated to sing in a certain way because of courtly reasons. So there were literally some institutions that brought to such development. Polyphonic music, essentially a type of music that consists of two or more melodic lines played or sung simultaneously, right? And this essentially already existed, but it, as we've seen, had not been started to be written down, and so started in that way, right? Everything was sort of more improvised. In polyphonic music, each line is independent and has its own melody, rhythm, and lyrics. And the reason why it began to affirm itself in the 15th century is due to, of course, several factors that can try to summarize, right? There is the rise of the Burgundian school in France, right? This was essentially a group of composers and musicians centered around the Duke of the Valois Burgundy, that, as you know, was considered also the most sort of updated for chivalric standards, and so all this courtly styles, etc., court in Europe. And these musicians of the Burgundian schools developed new techniques for writing and performing polyphonic music connected to the court. We're talking, for example, about isorhythm and complex harmonies. And this innovative approach to polyphony, that let's remember, it had always existed, influenced, however, and inspired composers all across Europe, making it more fashionable, more applicable also to the other courts, given the strengthening of, again, the various national monarchies at the time. Then there was also an advancement in music notation. Notation systems improved during this period, allowing composers and musicians to write and read polyphonic music more effectively. This made it possible to notate multiple melodic lines accurately, enabling the precise composition and performance of more complex polyphonic works. The Renaissance was kicking in, and so as a period characterized by a renewed interest in ancient Greek and Roman culture and scientific advancements, etc., this brought with itself an invariable desire of innovation and creativity in various fields, including music. Right, so composers began experimenting with new forms, harmonies, counterpoint, leading to the development and popularization of polyphony as well. Printing, too, had an effect later on in the century, right, in the mid-15th. You have, of course, everything written right now being printed and thus reproduced more easily and circulating more widely. This facilitated the dissemination of polyphonic compositions, making them accessible to broader audiences and encouraging sort of competition, a broader market, let's say, for music as well. All these factors are crucial to understand why this development occurred. Now, it's possible that the music played on the instruments that we've seen differ to an important extent. Instruments such as the bagpipe, hurdy-gurdy, and flat-bridge fiddle, which played drones, as well as those with a limited range couldn't handle the new repertoire, fell out of favor with the with the establishment. It became associated at that point with common people. Right? It wasn't, say, the same nobility was sort of stratifying dramatically, and so everything became, with increased power of the monarch, is also referring to that higher spheres. Some instruments, however, adapted to such new requirements. This would be obvious just by the technical needs. For example, the playing technique for the lute shifted from using a plectrum to using fingers, so this enabled the execution of multiple lines and chords, as we were saying before, and other instruments that easily accommodated this new repertoire, especially those capable of playing multiple lines like the organ and clavichord, gained popularity. Additionally, new instruments with larger ranges such as the violin and viol were developed. Right. So this would naturally and obviously increase the complexity of music, and of course much was going on again with polyphony itself. It's such a huge topic, but I will also know where to get some help in the case I had to be more precise with it, because I have people that are in my life that are connected with this, and hopefully we can get some of that from it. Naturally, again, this is just a chat about the variety of instruments and a bit of their changes throughout medieval France. It focuses, as you understand, our goal here, it's to observe how at the political and social change you have also basically anything else change. But it's also a system that doesn't quite differ enormously throughout the entire millennium. So yes, for those time beings, changes were very big, sometimes even, as we've seen, in the span of a century. But also we see that there is an important basis that had also not differed too much from ancient times after all. But it's in the Middle Ages that it really starts through the elites, the courts, etc., refining ever more. And surely we will talk more about military music instruments as well. So there is already something on my channel. I think I've never created a playlist under the same name. If you search for trumpets, something like that, or military music, you will find something, and we'll surely come back on it. Hopefully, say soon. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.